Sometimes the hardest battles we face aren't against others, but against our own broken hearts. Eli Mercer understood this truth as he stood in the afternoon heat, staring at the warehouse that everyone said would ruin him. The rusted metal walls stretched before him like a monument to decay. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete. Boarded windows stared back like empty eyes. His 10-year-old daughter Lena kicked at loose stones, her curiosity stronger than the building's ugliness. The neighbors had made their feelings clear he was foolish for keeping this worthless inheritance when bills were piling up and practical matters demanded attention. But something in Lena's excited voice, as she pointed to strange markings on the walls, made him pause. She saw possibility where others saw problems. What if this crumbling structure held more than just rust and memories? What if the very thing everyone mocked him for might change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli Mercer had never imagined his life would look like this. 3 years ago, he'd been standing in front of a classroom full of 8th graders, teaching American history with the passion of someone who believed the past could guide the future. Sarah would pick him up after school in their reliable Honda, and they'd drive home together, talking about their day, planning weekend adventures with Lena, dreaming about the house they'd buy when they saved enough for a down payment. Now the Honda was gone, sold to pay for medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Sarah was gone too, taken by cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. And Eli found himself living in a double-wide trailer on the outskirts of Millbrook, Ohio, working 2 part-time jobs stocking shelves at the grocery store before dawn and tutoring kids after school just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. The trailer park sat on the edge of town like an afterthought, where the lucky folks lived who couldn't quite afford apartments but hadn't given up entirely. Eli's unit was clean but cramped, with thin walls that let in every sound from the neighbors, and a kitchen window that looked out onto the rusted chain-link fence separating them from the abandoned industrial district beyond. Lena handled the transition better than he did. At 10 years old, she possessed her mother's optimism and an imagination that could transform their small space into castles, spaceships, or archaeological dig sites, depending on the day's adventure. She'd inherited Sarah's dark hair and quick smile, but her eyes, those were pure Eli, deep brown and thoughtful, always searching for the story behind the story. "Dad, look at this," Lena called from the warehouse steps, where she'd been examining the metal siding while he fumbled with the keys Uncle Harold's lawyer had given him. The building loomed above them, 3 stories of corrugated steel and broken promises. "These aren't regular scratches. See how they're all in patterns?" Eli squinted at the marks she was tracing with her finger. To him, they looked like random damage from decades of weather and neglect. But Lena had always seen things differently, patterns in clouds, faces in wallpaper, stories in the way shadows fell across their kitchen table. "It's probably just where the siding got banged up over the years, honey," he said, though something about the deliberate spacing of the marks made him pause. Uncle Harold never mentioned anything special about this place. That wasn't entirely true. Harold Mercer had been Eli's father's younger brother, a man who'd never married, never had kids, and kept to himself for most of his 78 years. He'd worked various jobs around town: mechanic, security guard, maintenance man, but had somehow managed to hold on to this warehouse when the rest of the industrial district went belly up in the 1990s. During family gatherings, Harold would sometimes get a distant look when talk turned to the old building. He'd mention how their grandfather had worked there back in the day, though he was always vague about details. When pressed, he'd change the subject or excuse himself to check on something in the kitchen. The funeral had been small, just Eli, Lena, and a handful of Harold's neighbors from the senior center. The lawyer's reading of the will had been even smaller. Everything went to Eli, including a warehouse that the property assessor valued at roughly the cost of the demolition it would require. "Why would Uncle Harold leave us a building that nobody wants?" Lena had asked on the drive over. "Maybe he thought we could sell it," Eli had replied, though even then he'd suspected there was more to it. Harold had been eccentric, but he wasn't foolish. If he'd wanted to leave them money, he would have sold the place himself. Now, standing in the afternoon heat with sweat beading on his forehead, Eli wondered if his uncle had been playing a longer game. The building was much older than the 1950s construction date listed in the county records. The architectural details didn't match the post-war industrial boom that had supposedly built it. The windows, though boarded up, had the deep sills and thick frames of 19th-century construction. The foundation stones looked hand-cut, not poured concrete. "Dad, there's a door over here that's different from the others," Lena called from around the corner. She'd wandered to the side of the building while he'd been lost in thought. "It's got this weird lock thing." Eli followed her voice and found her standing before a narrow door he hadn't noticed during his previous visits. Unlike the main entrance, which had a standard industrial lock, this door featured an unusual mechanism, a circular lock plate with symbols instead of numbers. "That's strange," he murmured, running his fingers over the symbols. They were worn but still visible: a star, a tree, a house, and what looked like a bird in flight. Lena pulled out her phony, a hand-me-down from her mother that Eli couldn't afford to replace but couldn't bear to take away. "I'm going to take pictures of everything," she announced. "Mom always said the best adventures start with good documentation." The mention of Sarah sent the familiar pang through Eli's chest. His wife had been the organized one, the planner, the one who saw potential where others saw problems. She would have loved this mystery, would have had them researching the building's history within hours of receiving the keys. "That's a good idea," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Your mom would be proud of your detective work." They spent the next hour circling the building, Lena photographing every unusual detail, while Eli tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The warehouse sat on nearly 2 acres, at the intersection of what had once been Main Street and the old River Road. Most of the surrounding buildings had been torn down or left to collapse, leaving the warehouse as a lonely monument to better times. Mrs. Patterson from the trailer next to theirs had made her opinion clear during their morning encounter at the mailboxes. "That eyesore has been bringing down property values for decades," she'd said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in the same place for 40 years. "Best thing you could do is sell it to those developers and take the money. Lord knows you could use it." She wasn't wrong about needing the money. Eli's teaching salary had barely covered their expenses when Sarah was alive and working part-time at the library. Now, with only his irregular income from the grocery store and tutoring, every month was a careful balance between necessary expenses and small emergencies that could derail everything. The developer, Jack Morrison, had already made contact through his real estate agent. Morrison Development had been buying up properties in the industrial district for years, assembling parcels for what he called Millbrook's economic revitalization. His offer for the warehouse was modest, but fair enough to pay off Eli's remaining debts and maybe put a down payment on a small house in a better school district. But something held him back from accepting. Maybe it was Harold's mysterious bequest, or the way Lena's eyes lit up when she talked about the strange markings, or simply the stubborn streak he'd inherited from his father's side of the family. Sarah used to tease him about his inability to let go of lost causes, how he'd spend hours trying to fix broken appliances instead of buying new ones. "You see possibility where other people see problems," she'd said during one of their late-night conversations about whether to keep trying for another baby after 2 miscarriages. "It's one of the things I love most about you." As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Eli found himself thinking about possibility. The warehouse might be ugly and unwanted, but it was also solid. The bones were good, as Sarah would have said. And if Lena was right about the markings being intentional, if there really was something special about this place, then maybe Uncle Harold had left them more than just a building. "Dad, I think I've figured out how to open that weird door," Lena called from the side entrance. She was holding her phone up, comparing her photos to something on the screen. "These symbols, they're not random. They tell a story." Eli walked over to where she stood, noting how the fading light caught the carved symbols differently, making them appear deeper and more deliberate. Whatever Uncle Harold had left them, whatever secrets this building held, he was beginning to understand that the real inheritance might not be the warehouse itself, but the opportunity to discover what it had always been meant to become. The symbols on the circular lock weren't random scratches after all. Lena had spent the better part of Sunday afternoon comparing her photos to images she'd found online, cross-referencing star patterns and bird shapes with the determination of a detective twice her age. When she finally cracked the sequence star, bird, house, tree, the lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through decades of silence. "Dad, it worked," she called, her voice trembling with excitement as the narrow door swung inward on hinges that protested with rusty squeaks. Cool air drifted out from the darkness beyond, carrying scents of old wood and something else, something that reminded Eli of his grandmother's attic, full of forgotten treasures and family secrets. Eli hurried over with the flashlight they'd brought from the truck. The beam revealed a small anteroom, perhaps 6 feet square, with wooden walls that looked far older than the metal exterior suggested. The craftsmanship was different, here hand-hewn beams, mortise and tenon joints, the kind of careful construction that spoke of a time when buildings were meant to last generations. "This doesn't match the rest of the warehouse," Eli murmured, running his hand along the smooth wood panels. His years of teaching history had given him an eye for architectural periods, and this interior belonged to the mid-1800s, not the 1950s industrial boom that supposedly built the place. Lena had already pushed deeper into the room, her phone's flashlight app revealing details the larger beam missed. "Dad, look at this," she whispered, her voice carrying the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. She was standing beside what appeared to be a wooden panel set into the far wall, but as Eli approached, he could see it wasn't just decorative. Carved into the wood was a cross, roughly 4 inches tall and weathered smooth by countless hands. But this wasn't just any cross it bore, initials carved along the horizontal beam, TW 1863. Below the date, someone had carefully carved a series of small notches, 17 in total, arranged in groups of 5 with 2 remaining. 1863, Eli breathed, his historian's mind immediately jumping to the significance. That's right in the middle of the Civil War. Lena traced the initials with her finger, her touch gentle and respectful. "Who do you think TW was, and what do these marks mean?" Before Eli could respond, her exploration revealed something else. The cross wasn't just carved into the panel, it was carved into a panel that moved. When she pressed against the wood surrounding the cross, it shifted slightly, revealing hidden hinges along one edge. "It's a door," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. "There's another room behind here." Eli's pulse quickened. Whatever they'd stumbled onto, it was becoming clear that Uncle Harold's warehouse held secrets that went far beyond outdated industrial equipment. The hidden room, the careful construction, the date from 1863 pieces of a puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was unlike anything he'd expected. The hidden panel opened to reveal a space roughly the size of a walk-in closet, but what it contained made both father and daughter catch their breath. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves sat items that clearly didn't belong in a 1950s warehouse: oil lanterns with hand-blown glass chimneys, wooden boxes with rope handles, folded blankets that felt like wool despite their age. But it was what Lena found tucked behind one of the lanterns that changed everything. Her small hands emerged from the shadows holding a wooden cross, smaller than the one carved into the panel, but clearly made by the same hands. This one was portable, designed to be carried, and when she turned it over, more initials appeared. M.J. Children, Safe Passage 1863. "Dad," Lena said softly, her voice filled with the weight of discovery. "I think people hid here. Real people. A long time ago." Eli took the cross from her hands, feeling the smooth wood that had been shaped by someone who'd cared enough to carve a message of hope into something meant to travel. The craftsmanship was simple but deliberate, the kind of work done by lamplight in stolen moments between more pressing concerns. His mind raced through the historical implications. Ohio in 1863. Hidden rooms, safe passage. The pieces formed a picture that made his breath catch in his throat. "Lena, I think you're right," he said quietly. "But I think they weren't just hiding from anything ordinary. I think they were hiding because their freedom depended on it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. If his suspicions were correct, if this building had served the purpose he was beginning to suspect, then Uncle Harold hadn't left them a worthless warehouse at all. He'd left them a piece of American history that had been forgotten by everyone except the man who'd spent his life protecting its secrets. Lena clutched his arm, her excitement barely contained. "We have to find out more, Dad. We have to know who MJ was and what happened to her children." Eli nodded, though part of him worried about where this discovery might lead. Their life was complicated enough without adding historical mysteries to the mix. But looking at his daughter's face, seeing the spark of curiosity and purpose that reminded him so much of Sarah, he knew they couldn't walk away from this. Whatever Uncle Harold had been protecting, whatever story this building held, they were now its guardians. The question was whether they were ready for the responsibility that came with such guardianship, and whether the truth they uncovered would prove to be a blessing or a burden they couldn't afford to carry. As they carefully returned the cross to its hiding place and prepared to leave, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The warehouse was no longer just an inheritance, it was a trust, passed down through generations to someone who might finally be ready to honor the courage of those who'd come before. The Millbrook Public Library had seen better days, but it remained the heart of the community's collective memory. Eli and Lena arrived early Monday morning, when the building still held the quiet reverence of a place where knowledge was treasured rather than consumed. Chen, the head librarian, greeted them with the kind smile she reserved for patrons who genuinely appreciated books rather than just tolerated them. "Mr. Mercer, how wonderful to see you both," she said, adjusting her reading glasses as she noticed the manila folder Eli carried. "Lena mentioned you'd made some interesting discoveries at your uncle's warehouse." Eli had called ahead, explaining their situation in general terms. Chen had known Uncle Harold. He'd been a regular visitor, always requesting books about local history and genealogy, though he'd never shared what he was researching. Now that detail seemed significant. "We found something that suggests the building might be older than the records indicate," Eli said, settling into one of the research tables, while Lena spread out her photographs. "We're hoping to understand more about its history." Ms. Chen examined the images with the practiced eye of someone who'd helped countless families trace their roots and property histories. When she reached the photograph of the carved cross, her eyebrows rose slightly. "This is remarkable craftsmanship," she murmured, "and that Dayton 1863, that would place it right in the middle of our most turbulent period." She looked up at Eli with growing interest. "Your uncle spent considerable time in our archives section. He seemed particularly interested in Underground Railroad documentation, though I never knew why." The confirmation hit Eli like a physical blow. Uncle Harold had known exactly what he was protecting, had spent years researching and documenting something he'd never shared with family. The weight of that secret, carried alone for decades, suddenly felt overwhelming. Lena leaned forward eagerly. "Miss Chen, do you have records about the Underground Railroad here in Millbrook?" "Some," Ms. Chen replied carefully. "Though you have to understand, secrecy was essential to the operation. Most conductors and station keepers left no written records. It was too dangerous. What we do have comes from post-war accounts, family stories passed down through generations, and occasional documentation that survived by accident rather than design." She led them to the archives section, where climate-controlled cabinets held the town's historical documents. As she pulled out folders and ledgers, Ms. Chen explained what historians knew about Underground Railroad activity in their region. "Ohio was crucial to the network," she said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd given this explanation many times. We had active routes from the Ohio River north to Canada, and many safe houses operated in towns like ours. The challenge is proving which buildings were actually involved. Eli opened the first folder she handed him and found himself looking at hand-drawn maps from the 1880s, created by former conductors who'd finally felt safe enough to document their work. His eyes scanned the carefully labeled locations. Station 3, Miller's Barn. Station 5, Church Cellar. Station 7, Industrial Building, River Road. Station 7, he read aloud, his finger tracing the notation. That's where our warehouse sits. Ms. Chen moved closer to examine the map. If that's accurate, it would make your building one of the most significant underground railroad sites in the county. But we'd need more evidence to verify the connection. That evidence came sooner than expected. While Ms. Chen pulled additional materials, Lena had been studying a collection of daguerreotype photographs donated by local families. These early photographic images, popular in the 1850s and 1860s, captured moments of daily life with startling clarity. "Dad," Lena whispered, her voice tight with excitement. "Look at this one." The photograph showed a well-dressed black family parents and 3 children posed formally in front of what appeared to be a wooden building. The image was faded but clear enough to make out architectural details. Behind the family, barely visible in the background, stood a structure that looked remarkably familiar. Eli studied the image closely, comparing it to his mental picture of the warehouse. The roofline was different, and wooden siding had obviously been replaced with metal, but the foundation stones were identical. The window placement matched exactly. Even the unusual side door was visible, though it appeared to be painted white rather than the weathered gray they'd found. "Miss Chen," Eli called softly, not wanting to break the library's peaceful atmosphere, "could you look at this photograph?" The librarian approached and examined the image through her magnifying glass. After several minutes of careful study, she sat back with a look of amazement. "Mr. Mercer, I believe what you found is documentary evidence of Underground Railroad activity. This family," she pointed to the formal group in the foreground, "they're dressed for travel, but they're also clearly posing for what might be their first official photograph. The building behind them shows signs of recent construction, and the placement matches your warehouse location exactly." Eli felt a chill run down his spine despite the library's warmth. These weren't just anonymous historical figures, they were real people who had stood where he and Lena had stood yesterday, who had found safety in a building that now belonged to his family. "Who were they?" Lena asked, her voice filled with the same reverence she'd shown in the hidden room. Miss Chen turned the photograph over, revealing faded ink notation in careful script. "The Johnson family, first free portrait, October 1863, safe arrival celebrated." "The Johnsons," she read aloud, "and if this notation is accurate, this photograph was taken to commemorate their successful journey to freedom. Your warehouse wasn't just a stop along the Underground Railroad, it was a destination where families could finally breathe safely." As they continued their research, the scope of their discovery became clearer. Uncle Harold hadn't just inherited a building, he'd inherited a responsibility. For decades, he'd quietly maintained and protected a site that had once meant the difference between slavery and freedom for hundreds of people. But understanding the building's significance also raised difficult questions. What obligations came with such knowledge? How could a struggling single father possibly preserve and honor such an important piece of history? And what would happen when word got out about what they'd found? As if summoned by Eli's worries, his phone buzzed with a text message from Jack Morrison's office. "Following up on warehouse offer. Time-sensitive opportunity. Please call today." Eli stared at the message, then at the photograph of the Johnson family, then at his daughter's eager face as she continued exploring the archives. The warehouse had just transformed from burden to treasure, but treasures came with their own complications. The question was no longer whether he could afford to keep the build in it, was whether he could afford to let it go. Dr. Rebecca Foster arrived in Millbrook on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with possibility. The call from Ms. Prekovozen. Chen had reached her at Ohio State University, where she served as the director of Underground Railroad Research, and the description of Eli's discoveries had prompted her to cancel 2 meetings and drive the 90 minutes to this small town she'd never heard of. Eli watched her examine the brass compass with the reverence of someone who understood its true value. They'd found it the evening before, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the warehouse's main room, and its discovery had confirmed what the photograph and cross had suggested. This building had been far more than a simple way station. "This is extraordinary, Doctor," Foster murmured, turning the compass over to reveal the engraved North Star on its back, surrounded by tiny etched words that read, "Follow to freedom." The brass had tarnished with age, but the craftsmanship remained elegant and purposeful. Navigation tools like this were precious beyond measure. Conductors guarded them with their lives. She was younger than Eli had expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but it was tempered by the scholarly caution of someone who'd seen too many historical claims crumble under scrutiny. "Tell me about your uncle," she said, settling into the folding chair Eli had brought from the trailer. They were sitting in the warehouse's main room, surrounded by the evidence of their growing investigation. Ms. Chen mentioned he'd been researching local Underground Railroad activity for years. Eli considered what he knew about Harold, realizing how little that actually was. He kept to himself mostly, never married, worked various jobs around town. But he maintained this building carefully, even when everyone else thought it was worthless. The property taxes alone must have cost him a significant portion of his income. "Men like your uncle are heroes in my field," Dr. Foster said seriously. "Without people willing to preserve and protect these sites, we lose crucial pieces of our nation's story. The Underground Railroad operated in secrecy by necessity, which means much of its history disappeared with the people who lived it." Lena had been listening intently while sketching the compass in her notebook, a habit she'd developed for documenting their discoveries. "Dr. Foster, how can we tell if more people came through here? Are there other things we should look for?" The historian smiled at Lena's directness. "Excellent question. Underground railroad sites often contain multiple types of evidence. Hidden spaces, obviously, but also practical items left behind: buttons, coins, pieces of clothing. Sometimes families carved their initials or left other marks to record their passage. And occasionally, if we're very fortunate, we find documentation." As if responding to her words, the warehouse seemed to offer up another secret. While Dr. Foster continued explaining research methods, Lena wandered toward a section of the building they hadn't thoroughly explored. The afternoon light, filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, caught something that made her stop and kneel beside what appeared to be just another section of flooring. "Dad, Dr. Foster, come look at this," she called, her voice carrying the same excitement that had led to all their previous discoveries. What she'd found was a loose board, warped with age, and separated just enough from its neighbors to reveal the edge of something hidden beneath. When Eli pried the board up carefully, they discovered a space that had been deliberately hollowed out, not for utilities or storage, but for concealment. Inside lay a collection of items that made Dr. Foster inhale sharply. 3 more compasses similar to the first, a small leather pouch containing coins from the 1860s, and something even more precious: folded papers wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and decay. Dr. Foster's hands trembled slightly as she carefully unfolded the first document. Her years of training had prepared her for many discoveries, but finding intact documentation from an active Underground Railroad station was like discovering buried treasure. "This is a conductor's log," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Look, dates, numbers of people, destinations. This is documentation of actual rescue operations." The page she held contained entries in careful handwriting. July 15, 1863, family of 5 from Kentucky, children ages 3, 7, 12. father skilled carpenter, proceeding to Detroit Station via Cleveland route. Safe departure before dawn. August 2, 1863, single woman, great courage, returned south to bring sister's children, provided compass and provisions for return journey. September 10, 1863, emergency passage, 15 souls, pursuit close behind, hidden 3 days until safe to continue, children brave beyond their years. Each entry represented real people, real families, real acts of extraordinary courage. The warehouse hadn't just been a building, it had been a beacon of hope in one of America's darkest periods. "How many people do you think passed through here?" Lena asked, her young mind trying to comprehend the scope of what they'd discovered. Dr. Foster continued reading, her expression growing more amazed with each page. "Based on these entries, at least several hundred over the course of the war. But this log probably only represents a fraction of the activity. Most conductors destroyed their records for safety." As the implications of their discovery sank in, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about historical significance anymore, it was about honoring the memory of people who'd risked everything for freedom and the conductors who'd risked everything to help them. But it was also about practical concerns that couldn't be ignored. Preserving and protecting such a site would require resources he didn't have, expertise he didn't possess, and time he couldn't spare while struggling to support his daughter. Dr. Foster seemed to sense his dilemma. "Mr. Mercer, discoveries like this are incredibly rare. With proper documentation and preservation, this site could become invaluable for education and historical understanding. There are grants available, historical societies that specialize in underground railroad preservation, museums that would partner with you." "But what would that mean for us?" Eli asked honestly. "We're barely getting by as it is. I can't afford to maintain this place, much less turn it into some kind of historical site." "It would mean," Dr. Foster said gently, "that you'd be giving a voice to people who were forced to travel in silence. It would mean ensuring that their courage isn't forgotten." As they locked up the warehouse and prepared to leave, Eli caught sight of Jack Morrison's black SUV parked across the street. The developer had been watching them, waiting, probably calculating how much this historical discovery might complicate his own plans. The battle for the warehouse's future was just beginning, but at least now Eli understood what they were really fighting for. The journal pages changed everything. 3 days after Dr. Foster's visit, Eli found himself holding documentation that transformed the warehouse from historical curiosity to priceless artifact. The conductor's journal, written in the careful hand of Thomas Whitmore, the same T.W., whose initials were carved into the wooden cross, revealed the human story behind the Underground Railroad station. Station 7 has received 37 souls this month. Read one entry from August 1863. The Johnson family departed safely for Detroit, but young Mary spoke of 3 cousins still in bondage near Louisville. Her determination to return for them humbles us all. "We provided compass and provisions, though I fear for her safety." Eli read the passage aloud to Lena as they sat at their trailer's small kitchen table. The journal spread between them like a treasure map to the past. Each entry painted a picture of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, families torn apart by slavery, conductors risking imprisonment or death, children showing courage that defied their tender years. "Listen to this one," Lena said, her finger tracing another entry. October 3, 1863, James Miller, age 14, arrived alone after walking 200 miles. Feet badly injured but spirit unbroken. Spent 2 weeks recovering before continuing to Canada. Left us his mother's wedding ring as payment, though we asked for nothing. Such generosity in the face of loss speaks to the character we are privileged to serve. The ring mentioned in the entry sat before them on the table, discovered in the same hiding place as the journal. It was simple gold, worn thin by years of wear, with an inscription that read, "Forever yours, 1845. Someone's most precious possession, given freely to strangers who'd shown kindness when the world offered little else. Dr. Foster had returned twice since the initial discovery, each visit revealing new layers of the warehouse's significance. The building had operated as Station 7 from 1862 until the war's end, helping an estimated 500 people reach freedom. Thomas Whitmore, identified through property records as the original owner, had been a conductor of remarkable dedication and courage. The scope of operation here was extraordinary. Dr. Foster had explained during her second visit, most stations handled a few dozen people over the entire war. 500 suggests this was a major hub, not just a way station. But with recognition came complications. Word of the discovery had begun spreading through academic circles, and Dr. Foster warned that media attention wouldn't be far behind. Historical sites of this significance inevitably attracted public interest, government attention, and unfortunately, people who saw opportunity rather than obligation. Jack Morrison had already proven to be in the latter category. His calls had become more frequent and insistent, his offers more aggressive. When polite pressure failed, he'd begun suggesting that Eli was being irresponsible by maintaining a building he couldn't properly preserve. Historical significance is all well and good, Morrison had said during an unannounced visit the previous evening, but sentiment doesn't pay for structural repairs or security systems. That building needs hundreds of thousands in restoration work just to be safe for visitors. He wasn't wrong about the costs. The warehouse needed new roofing, electrical systems, climate control for artifact preservation, and security measures to protect irreplaceable historical materials. Even with grants and donations, the financial commitment would be enormous. But Morrison's real concern wasn't preservation, it was profit. His development company had been assembling properties in the industrial district for a massive mixed-use project. The warehouse sat in the center of his planned development, and its historical protection would complicate everything. "You have to think about Lena's future," Morrison had continued, his tone shifting to apparent concern. "College isn't getting cheaper, and she deserves better than trailer park living. The right buyer would pay enough to change your family's entire trajectory." Those words echoed in Eli's mind now as he watched his daughter carefully photographing each journal page, her dedication to documentation rivaling that of professional historians. Lena had thrown herself into the research with the passion of someone who'd found her calling, and her excitement was infectious. At school, she'd become something of a celebrity. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had invited her to present their discoveries to the class, and word had spread throughout the building. Other students sought her out at lunch, eager to hear about the hidden rooms and secret passages. For the first time since Sarah's death, Lena seemed truly happy. But happiness didn't pay bills or guarantee security. Eli's tutoring income had dropped as he spent more time at the warehouse, and the grocery store manager had already warned him about missed shifts. The responsible thing might be to sell to Morrison, use the money to provide Lena with stability and opportunities. Yet every time he considered that option, he thought about the families who'd found refuge in those hidden rooms, about Thomas Whitmore's careful documentation of their courage, about Uncle Harold's decades of silent guardianship. How could he be the one to end that chain of protection? "Dad," Lena said, looking up from her careful copying of the journal entries, "what does this mean?" She pointed to a notation that appeared repeatedly throughout the log. "Package delivered safely to Northern Star." Eli studied the phrase, noting how Whitmore had used it consistently to mark successful passages. "I think Northern Star was code for Canada," he said, "the final destination where people would be truly free." Lena nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her work. Watching her, Eli realized that his daughter was learning more than just history from their discoveries. She was learning about courage, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, about the importance of preserving truth in a world that often preferred comfortable lies. That evening, as they prepared to leave the warehouse, Lena made a discovery that would prove to be the most significant yet. While Eli carefully wrapped the journal for transport back to the trailer, she was exploring the hidden room one more time, her phone's flashlight revealing details they'd missed in previous visits. "Dad, there's something else here," she called from the depths of the concealed space. "It's bigger than the other things." What she'd found, wedged behind the wooden shelves, was a leather portfolio tied with string. When Eli carefully opened it, they discovered the complete architectural plans for the warehouse's construction, drawn in 1862 and signed by T. Whitmore himself. The plans revealed the building's true genius. It appeared to be a simple industrial warehouse from the outside, but the interior contained a sophisticated network of hidden rooms, concealed passages, and escape routes. Whitmore hadn't just created a safe house, he'd engineered a fortress of freedom. The iron shackles lay heavy in Eli's hands, their weight carrying the burden of history and the triumph of those who'd broken free. They discovered them in the underground chamber Lena had found behind a false wall in the warehouse basementa room that hadn't appeared on any of Whitmore's architectural plans, suggesting it had been added as an emergency measure during the war's most dangerous period. The shackles themselves told a story of liberation. The chain linking the ankle cuffs had been deliberately filed through, the metal showing careful work done over time rather than sudden breakage. Someone had patiently worked toward freedom, link by link, until the bonds that held them finally gave way. "Dr. Foster needs to see these immediately," Eli said, though his voice carried uncertainty about what such a discovery would mean for their family's future. Every artifact they uncovered seemed to increase both the historical significance of the site and the impossibility of their situation. The media attention had started a brief mention in the local newspaper about interesting historical discoveries at the old warehouse. But academic interest had grown quickly, and Dr. Foster warned him that national attention was inevitable. Underground railroad sites of this completeness were extraordinarily rare, and the combination of intact architecture, detailed documentation, and preserved artifacts created a perfect storm of historical importance. "You understand what you're sitting on, don't you?" Dr. Foster had asked during her latest visit, her excitement barely contained despite her professional demeanor. "This isn't just a local historical site. This is a nationally significant location that could rewrite our understanding of underground railroad operations in the Midwest." But national significance came with national complications. The phone calls had started reporters from Columbus and Cleveland wanting interviews, historians requesting access to the artifacts, preservation societies offering assistance that sounded more like polite demands. Eli felt overwhelmed by attention he'd never sought and responsibilities he wasn't sure he could handle. Lena, meanwhile, had embraced their sudden fame with the adaptability of childhood. Her presentation at school had led to an invitation to speak at the County Historical Society, where she'd charmed an audience of adults with her careful documentation and infectious enthusiasm for the warehouse's secrets. "My dad says we're like archaeological detectives," she told the gathering, her confidence growing with each public appearance. "Every artifact tells us something about the brave people who used to hide in our building." Her use of the word "our" hadn't escaped Eli's notice. Somewhere in the process of discovery, the warehouse had transformed from burden to beloved project, at least in Lena's mind. She'd begun referring to Thomas Whitmore as Mr. Thomas, and spoke about the families they'd documented as if they were distant relatives whose stories needed telling. But Jack Morrison's pressure had intensified alongside the media attention. His latest approach involved the city council, where he'd raised concerns about public safety and proper maintenance of historical sites. The building needed immediate structural assessment, he argued, and private owners couldn't be expected to meet the standards required for public historical preservation. "I'm not trying to be difficult," Morrison had said during their most recent encounter, his tone suggesting anything but goodwill. "But if this building is as historically important as people claim, shouldn't it be in the hands of professionals who can properly care for it?" The subtext was clear: sell to his development company, which would then donate the site to appropriate historical authorities while proceeding with the surrounding development. Eli would get his money, the artifacts would be properly preserved in a controlled environment, and Morrison would get the rest of the land he needed for his project. It was a reasonable proposal that made practical sense, which made Eli's resistance to it feel stubborn and selfish. What right did a struggling single father have to control such an important piece of history? Wouldn't the artifacts be better served in a real museum with proper climate control and security? Yet every time he considered accepting Morrison's offer, he thought about Uncle Harold's decades of solitary guardianship, about Thomas Whitmore's careful construction of a sanctuary that had saved hundreds of lives, about the families who'd trusted this place with their freedom and their future. The shackles in his hands seemed to whisper their own answer. They'd been broken by someone who refused to accept what others called reasonable, who'd chosen difficult freedom over easy bondage. How could he honor that courage by choosing the comfortable path himself? "Dad," Lena said, emerging from the underground chamber with dirt on her knees and excitement in her voice. "I found something else. I think it's important." She led him down the narrow stairs they'd discovered behind the false wall, her phone's flashlight revealing the chamber that had become their most significant discovery yet. The space was larger than the hidden room upstairs, roughly 12 feet square, with walls of fitted stone that spoke of permanent construction rather than temporary concealment. What Lena had found, carved into one of the stone walls, was a list of names, etched carefully into the rock with tools that had required patience and determination. The names covered nearly the entire wall, arranged in columns with dates beside each entry. Johnson family, 5 souls, Oct 1863. Mary Catherine returned for cousins, Aug 1863. James Miller, alone but strong, Oct 1863. Williams family, 7 souls, Nov 1863. The list continued for dozens of entries, a permanent record of courage that had survived 160 years of secrecy. At the bottom of the wall, in slightly different handwriting, someone had added a final note. "May their courage light the way for generations yet to come. TW 1865. Standing in that underground chamber, surrounded by the evidence of so much bravery and sacrifice, Eli felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about preserving history, it was about continuing a legacy of protection and sanctuary that had begun with Thomas Whitmore and continued through Uncle Harold. The question was no longer whether he could afford to keep the warehouse. The question was whether he could afford to let it go, knowing what it represented and what his family's guardianship might mean for future generations, seeking to understand the true cost of freedom. As they climbed back toward daylight, the filed shackles secure in his pocket, Eli realized that some inheritances came with obligations that couldn't be measured in dollars. Uncle Harold had spent his life protecting this place, not because it was profitable, but because it was necessary. Now that responsibility belonged to them, and despite the challenges ahead, Eli was beginning to understand that carrying it might be the most important work he'd ever do. The legal deed that changed everything was hidden in the last place. Eli expected to find it inside Uncle Harold's ancient coffee can, tucked between his will and a collection of photographs that revealed a lifetime of careful documentation. The paper was yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved, bearing an official seal from the state of Ohio and language that made Eli's hands shake as he read it aloud to Lena. By order of the Ohio legislature, in recognition of extraordinary service to the cause of human freedom, this property shall remain in perpetual trust as a sanctuary and memorial to those who risked all for liberty. Said property shall be protected from commercial development and shall pass only to heirs who pledge to honor its sacred purpose. Dated this 15th day of April, 1865. The date hit Eli like lightning. April 15th, 1865, the day Abraham Lincoln died. Someone in the Ohio legislature had rushed through protective legislation for the warehouse on the very day the great emancipator was assassinated. as if they'd known that preserving these sanctuaries would become more critical than ever. "Dad, what does this mean?" Lena asked, though her voice suggested she already understood the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "It means Uncle Harold didn't just leave us a building," Eli said slowly, his mind racing through the implications. "He left us a legally protected historical site that can't be sold for development, ever." The discovery explains so much about Harold's behavior over the years: his fierce protection of the warehouse despite financial hardship, his refusal to discuss the building's significance, his careful research into Underground Railroad history. He'd been the guardian of something far more important than anyone realized, and he'd spent his entire adult life ensuring it remained protected. But it also explained the urgent tone of Jack Morrison's recent communications. If Morrison had suspected the existence of such protection, it would explain his increasingly aggressive tactics and his attempts to involve city officials in forcing a sale. The coffee can contained other revelations that painted a picture of Harold's secret life as historical guardian. Photographs showed him meticulously maintaining the warehouse over the decades, repairing the roof, replacing damaged siding, ensuring that the building's structural integrity remained sound while preserving its historical authenticity. More shocking were the letters, dozens of them, from historians, preservationists, and descendants of Underground Railroad participants who'd somehow learned about the warehouse's significance. Harold had corresponded with them all, sharing information about the artifacts and documentation while steadfastly refusing to allow public access. "The time isn't right," he'd written in one letter dated just 2 years earlier. "The current political climate makes protection more important than publicity. When the right guardian emerges, someone who understands both the historical significance and the personal sacrifice required, then perhaps these stories can be safely shared." Dr. Foster's assessment had been prophetic. Within days of their initial media coverage, the warehouse had attracted attention from the Smithsonian Institution, the National Park Service, and the Underground Railroad Freedom Network. Each organization offered assistance, expertise, and funding, but also oversight, bureaucracy, and loss of family control. Mr. Mercer, the Smithsonian representative, had explained during a conference call, "Sites of this significance typically require professional management. While we appreciate your family's guardianship, proper preservation demands resources and expertise that go beyond individual capability." The pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Morrison continued his legal challenges, arguing that private ownership of such historically significant property was irresponsible. Academic institutions offered partnerships that sounded more like polite acquisitions. Government agencies hinted at eminent domain proceedings if proper preservation standards weren't met. But the protective deed held firm. The language was clear, and legally binding the property could only pass to heirs who pledged to honor its sacred purpose. Harold had chosen his words carefully, ensuring that the warehouse would remain a sanctuary rather than becoming a commodity. The revelation that transformed everything came when Lena discovered Harold's personal journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the warehouse's main room. Unlike Whitmore's conductor's log, this journal documented Harold's own journey of discovery, beginning in 1965, when he'd first learned about the building's true purpose from his dying father. "Dad told me about the warehouse on his deathbed," Harold had written in his careful script. "Said it wasn't just a building, but a trust passed down through our family. His grandfather had worked with Thomas Whitmore, helping to maintain the station during its most dangerous years. When Whitmore died in 1867, our family became the guardians." The entry continued with details that explained Harold's lifelong dedication. "Every generation has kept the secret, waiting for the right time to share the story. Dad said I'd know when that time came, when someone appeared who had both the passion to preserve the history and the strength to protect it from those who would exploit it." Eli read those words with growing understanding. Harold hadn't left him the warehouse randomly. He'd been watching, waiting, looking for signs that Eli might be the next guardian the property needed. Sarah's death had actually convinced Harold that Eli possessed the character necessary for such guardianship, someone who'd learned to protect what mattered most, even when it cost everything. But the journal's most shocking revelation came in its final entry, dated just weeks before Harold's death. Eli shows promise, but he'll need help. The girl sees what others miss. She has the gift. If they can work together, if they can understand what this place really means, they might be the ones to finally share its story with the world. Harold had been testing them, watching their progress, evaluating their worthiness. The gradual revelation of artifacts, the carefully preserved documentation, even the placement of clues had all been orchestrated to ensure that the warehouse's next guardians understood both its significance and their responsibilities. Standing in the warehouse that evening, surrounded by evidence of 160 years of courage and sacrifice, Eli finally understood what Uncle Harold had seen in him. The ability to protect something precious even when it came at personal cost. The willingness to choose difficult right over easy wrong. The strength to carry a burden that others couldn't even see. Morrison's latest offer sat on his kitchen table back at the trailer, $2 million for immediate sale, enough to secure Lena's entire future. But looking at the protective deed in his hands, reading Harold's words about sacred trust and generational responsibility, Eli realized that some things couldn't be bought or sold. The warehouse belonged to history now, and history had chosen his family as its guardians. The only question was whether they were worthy of that trust. The leather-bound ledger represented Thomas Whitmore's masterwork, a complete record of every soul who'd found freedom through Station 7. 847 names, carefully inscribed in fading ink, each entry representing a family reunited, a child given hope, a human being transformed from property to person. Eli discovered it in Whitmore's personal quarters, a small room behind the conductor's office that Harold had sealed off for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its treasures. The courtroom battle was set for Friday morning, just 5 days away. Jack Morrison had filed an emergency petition challenging the 1,865 protective deed, claiming it was legally obsolete and arguing that proper historical preservation required professional management that Eli couldn't provide. The hearing would determine not just the warehouse's fate, but the future of every family story preserved within its walls. Each name in this ledger represents someone who bet their life on freedom, Dr. Foster explained as she helped Eli prepare for his testimony. They sat in the warehouse's main room, surrounded by carefully organized evidence that would either save or doom their cause. When you testify, remember that you're not just defending property rights, you're defending their legacy. Eli studied the ledger entries, noting how Whitmore had recorded not just names and dates, but personal details that revealed the humanity behind the historical facts. Samuel Green, blacksmith, age 32, carried his elderly mother 400 miles rather than leave her behind. The Washington children, ages 4, 6, and 8, lost parents to cholera but refused separation, found new family in Detroit. Each story reinforced what Eli had come to understand. The warehouse wasn't just a building or even a historical site, it was a repository of human courage that demanded protection from those who would see only commercial opportunity. But Morrison's legal team had prepared well. They'd assembled expert witnesses who would testify about the complexities of historical preservation, the costs of proper maintenance, and the legal precedents for transferring significant historical properties to institutional control. They documented every structural deficiency in the warehouse, every potential safety hazard, every way that Eli's limited resources fell short of professional standards. They'll argue that good intentions aren't enough, his lawyer, Maria Santos, had warned during their preparation session. Santos worked primarily with working families facing legal challenges, and she'd taken Eli's case, partly because she believed in the cause, and partly because the pro bono work balanced her soul against the harsh realities of legal practice. Morrison's team will paint you as a well-meaning amateur who's in over his head, she continued. They'll suggest that proper preservation requires expertise and resources you simply don't have. It was a damaging argument because it contained truth. Eli wasn't a historian, preservationist, or museum professional. He was a former teacher working part-time jobs and living in a trailer park, trying to raise his daughter while honoring a responsibility he'd never asked for. But Lena had become his secret weapon in preparing for the hearing. Her natural curiosity and careful documentation had uncovered details that even professional historians had missed. She'd created a comprehensive catalogue of every artifact, mapped the building's hidden spaces, and researched the historical context with the thoroughness of someone twice her age. "Mr. Morrison doesn't understand what this place really means," she'd said during one of their evening preparation sessions. "He thinks it's just old stuff, but we know it's proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." The community response had been mixed, but generally supportive. The local newspaper had run a series of articles about the discoveries, and public opinion seemed to favor preservation over development. But Morrison had his supporters too, people who valued economic development over historical sentiment, who believed that progress required leaving the past behind. Mrs. Patterson had emerged as an unexpected ally. Despite her initial skepticism about Eli's obsession with the warehouse, she'd been moved by Lena's school presentation and had organized a petition supporting historical preservation. "That girl opened my eyes," she'd admitted to Eli, "made me realize we've been sitting next to something important all these years without knowing it." The petition had gathered nearly 400 signatures, impressive for a town of 0 residents. But Morrison's supporters had organized too, circulating their own petition that emphasized job creation, tax revenue, and the practical benefits of modern development over what they called dwelling on the past. As Friday approached, Eli found himself caught between confidence and terror. The evidence was overwhelming: the artifacts, the documentation, the protective deed, the community support. But legal battles weren't won by evidence alone, and Morrison had resources that far exceeded anything Eli could muster. "Remember," Dr. Foster said during their final preparation session, "you're not just representing yourself in that courtroom. You're representing every person whose name appears in that ledger, every family who found safety in those hidden rooms, every conductor who risked everything to help strangers find freedom." The weight of that representation felt enormous, but it also felt right. Eli had spent 2 years feeling like he was failing at everything, failing as a provider, failing as a father, failing to honor Sarah's memory by building the life they'd planned together. But standing in the warehouse surrounded by evidence of courage that had transcended generations, he realized that perhaps he'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. Teaching history had given him respect for the past. Losing Sarah had taught him that some fights were worth every sacrifice. Raising Lena had shown him that the future depended on the stories we chose to preserve and the values we chose to protect. The hearing would determine whether the warehouse remained under family guardianship or passed to institutional control, whether its stories would be told by people who loved them or managed by professionals who understood them. But regardless of the outcome, Eli knew that Harold's trust had already been honored, the warehouse's secrets had been revealed, its stories had found their voice, and its legacy would continue through the daughter who saw possibility where others saw problems. As he tucked the ledger carefully into its protective case, Eli thought about the hundreds of families whose names filled its pages. They'd faced impossible odds and chosen courage over comfort, hope over despair. Tomorrow, in a county courthouse that probably wouldn't have admitted many of them 160 years ago, their descendant would fight to ensure their sacrifice wasn't forgotten. The irony wasn't lost on him that the legal system that had once sanctioned their bondage would now decide whether their sanctuary remained protected. But justice, like freedom, was a long arc that bent slowly toward righteousness. Sometimes it took generations to complete the journey. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Margaret Kowalski examined the Underground Railroad map that had become the centerpiece of their case. The hand-drawn document, discovered just days before the hearing in a sealed envelope marked, "For the judge who must decide," showed the complete network of stations that had operated through central Ohio during the Civil War. Station 7 was clearly marked at the intersection of Main Street and River Road, with detailed notations about capacity, security measures, and escape routes. "This is unprecedented," Judge Kowalski murmured, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood they were witnessing history. "Mr. Santos, where exactly was this map discovered?" Maria Santos stood to address the court, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Your Honor, the map was found in Thomas Whitmore's personal effects, sealed and preserved by the defendant's uncle, specifically for this purpose. Mr. Harold Mercer left explicit instructions that it should only be revealed if the property's protection was legally challenged." Morrison's lead attorney, James Crawford, immediately objected. "Your Honor, this convenient discovery strains credibility. We're expected to believe that crucial evidence was withheld until the most dramatic possible moment." But Dr. Foster's expert testimony had already established the map's authenticity. The paper dated correctly to the 1860s, the ink matched samples from other Whitmore documents, and the geographical details corresponded exactly to known Underground Railroad routes. More importantly, the map's existence explained discrepancies in other historical records that had puzzled researchers for decades. "The prosecution wants the court to believe that historical preservation requires institutional control," Eli said when called to testify, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "But the very existence of this map proves otherwise. It survived 160 years, not because it was managed by professionals, but because ordinary people understood its value and chose to protect it." Judge Kowalski leaned forward, her attention focused entirely on Eli's testimony. "Mr. Mercer, the court appreciates your family's dedication to preservation, but Mr. Morrison's concerns about proper maintenance and public access aren't unreasonable. How can you ensure that artifacts of this significance will receive appropriate care?" The question struck at the heart of Morrison's argument that good intentions couldn't substitute for professional expertise and institutional resources. Crawford had spent the morning presenting evidence of the warehouse's structural deficiencies, the costs of proper preservation, and the complexities of operating a public historical site. "Your Honor," Eli replied, thinking of the names in Whitmore's ledger, "the people who built this sanctuary didn't have professional training or institutional resources either. They had something more important. They understood that some things are worth protecting, regardless of the cost." He gestured toward the evidence table, where the artifacts lay carefully arranged. Thomas Whitmore was a carpenter, not a historian. The families who found safety here were farmers, laborers, domestic workers, ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. They created something that has lasted 160 years, not because they were professionals, but because they believed in what they were doing. Morrison himself took the stand to present his company's proposal for purchasing the property and transferring it to the Ohio Historical Society. His testimony was polished and persuasive, emphasizing his commitment to preserving the warehouse's historical significance while ensuring professional management and public access. "Mr. Mercer's passion is admirable," Morrison said, his tone respectful but firm. "But passion without proper resources leads to deterioration and loss. My company is prepared to fund a complete restoration that would transform this site into a world-class historical attraction while ensuring its preservation for future generations." The offer was compelling. $15 million for the property, with an additional $10 million committed to restoration and operational endowment. The warehouse would become a state-of-the-art museum with proper climate control, security systems, and educational programs. Eli would receive enough money to secure Lena's entire future while knowing the historical artifacts were professionally preserved. Crawford reinforced the argument with testimony from preservation experts who detailed the challenges of maintaining historical sites, the legal liabilities of public access, and the specialized knowledge required for artifact conservation. Their case was logical, well-funded, and professionally presented. But when Dr. Foster returned to the witness stand for redirect examination, she brought evidence that reframed the entire debate. The research community had been following the case closely, and her testimony revealed support that went far beyond academic interest. Your Honor, the Underground Railroad Freedom Network has committed to providing Mr. Mercer with comprehensive support for site preservation and operation, she announced. We're talking about a consortium of universities, museums, and historical societies that would provide expertise, funding, and oversight while maintaining family guardianship. The proposal represented a third option that neither Morrison nor his legal team had anticipated: professional support without institutional takeover, preservation assistance without loss of family control. The Freedom Network would provide conservation expertise, educational programming, and operational funding while allowing the Mercer family to remain as site guardians. Judge Kowalski examined the Freedom Network's detailed proposal, her expression growing more interested as she read. The plan addressed every concern Morrison had raised, while preserving the family guardianship that had protected the site for generations. "This is quite comprehensive," she observed. "Dr. Foster, what guarantees can your organization provide that this support will continue long-term?" "The same guarantee that has protected this site for 160 years, Your Honor," Dr. Foster replied. "The commitment of people who understand that some things transcend commercial value. The Freedom Network represents institutions that have dedicated themselves to preserving Underground Railroad history precisely because that history might otherwise be lost." As the morning session concluded, Eli felt cautiously optimistic. The evidence was strong, the legal protection seemed solid, and the Freedom Network's support addressed the practical concerns about professional preservation. But Morrison's resources were formidable, and legal battles could turn on technicalities that had nothing to do with justice or historical significance. During the lunch recess, Lena approached him with the quiet confidence she'd developed over weeks of public attention. "Dad, whatever happens, we did the right thing. Mr. Thomas and all those families, they know we tried to protect their stories." Her certainty gave him strength for the afternoon session, when Morrison's team would present their final arguments and the judge would decide whether 160 years of family guardianship would continue or whether the warehouse would pass to institutional control, preservation, and the uncertain mercies of professional management. The letter that changed everything was written in Sarah's careful handwriting, discovered in Harold's personal effects, just as the court session resumed. Maria Santos read it aloud with trembling hands, her voice carrying the weight of a message that had waited years to be heard. "Dear Harold, Eli doesn't know I'm writing this, but I wanted you to understand how much your trust means to our family. He's told me about your conversations regarding the warehouse, and while he doesn't yet grasp the building's true significance, I see the way his eyes light up when he talks about preserving history for future generations." The courtroom was utterly silent as the letter continued, Sarah's words bridging the gap between past and present with startling clarity. "I know my time is growing short, and I know Eli will struggle with the choices ahead. But I also know that underneath his practical concerns lies the heart of someone who understands that some things matter more than money. When the time comes for him to decide what the warehouse means to him, to us, to Lena's future, I trust he'll choose preservation over profit, legacy over convenience." Judge Kowalski's expression had grown increasingly thoughtful as the letter progressed, but it was the final paragraph that transformed the entire proceeding. "The warehouse will need a guardian who sees its true value, someone who understands that the greatest inheritance we can leave our children isn't financial security, but the knowledge that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort. Eli is that person, even if he doesn't know it yet. Please be patient with him as he learns to see what you and I already know, that some trusts can't be measured in dollars." The letter was dated just 3 months before Sarah's death, written during her final hospitalization when she'd known her time was running out. Harold had kept it private, waiting for the moment when its message would carry the most weight. Morrison's attorney immediately challenged the letter's relevance, arguing that emotional appeals couldn't override legal requirements for proper historical preservation. But Judge Kowalski's response suggested the letter had accomplished exactly what Sarah intended. "Mr. Crawford, this letter speaks directly to the question of guardianship fitness that your client has raised," the judge said firmly. "It provides insight into the character assessment that led to the current inheritance arrangement and demonstrates that the transfer of guardianship was carefully considered rather than arbitrary." Dr. Foster had prepared additional testimony about the letter's historical context, explaining how family guardianship had been essential to Underground Railroad site preservation throughout American history. Professional institutions, she noted, had often failed to protect such sites because they lacked the personal connection that motivated multi-generational commitment. "Institutional preservation focuses on artifacts," she explained to the court. "Family guardianship preserves stories. Mr. Mercer and his daughter haven't just discovered objects, they've uncovered the human narrative that gives those objects meaning." The afternoon testimony revealed the true scope of community support for continued family guardianship. Mrs. Patterson spoke about watching Eli's dedication to the project despite his financial struggles. Ms. Probiger, problig.org, Ms. Chen described his respectful approach to research and his genuine reverence for the historical significance of their discoveries. Even some of Morrison's own employees testified about their growing appreciation for the warehouse's importance. But it was Lena's testimony that proved most powerful. Judge Kowalski had initially hesitated to allow a 10-year-old to address the court, but Lena's careful documentation and obvious expertise had convinced her to make an exception. "Your Honor," Lena said, her voice clear and confident as she stood before the bench, "my dad taught me that history isn't just about things that happened a long time ago. It's about understanding how brave people in the past can teach us to be brave today." She gestured toward the artifacts displayed on the evidence table. "Every family that hid in our warehouse was scared, but they chose to keep going anyway. Mr. Thomas helped them even though it was dangerous. Uncle Harold protected their story even though nobody understood why it mattered." Judge Kowalski leaned forward, clearly moved by Lena's earnest presentation. "And what do you think should happen to the warehouse now, Lena?" "I think it should stay with people who love it," Lena replied, without hesitation. "Museums are good, but they're for looking at things behind glass. Our warehouse should be a place where people can touch history, where they can understand that the families who hid there were real people just like us." Her final statement drew nods from several spectators and seemed to visibly affect the judge. "We don't need to be professionals to care about something important. We just need to remember that some things are worth protecting, even when it's hard." Morrison's closing argument was polished and logical, emphasizing the practical benefits of institutional control and the risks of amateur preservation efforts. Crawford painted a picture of good intentions leading to gradual deterioration, of irreplaceable artifacts being lost to improper care and inadequate security. But Maria Santos's closing focused on the letter from Sarah, the protective deed from 1865, and the 160-year tradition of family guardianship that had brought them to this moment. "Your Honor, this case isn't really about professional versus amateur preservation. It's about whether we trust the same kind of ordinary people who created this sanctuary to continue protecting it." As the session concluded, Judge Kowalski announced she would render her decision within 48 hours. The evidence was substantial, the legal arguments complex, and the implications far-reaching. But looking at Eli and Lena sitting together in the front row, surrounded by artifacts that represented so much courage and sacrifice, she seemed to understand that some decisions transcended legal technicalities. This court will consider not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the protection that was established in 1865, she said before adjourning. "The question before us is whether family guardianship remains the best way to honor that protection, or whether institutional control better serves the historical significance of this remarkable site." As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Eli felt the strange calm that comes after maximum effort has been expended. They'd presented their case as completely and honestly as possible. Sarah's letter had provided the emotional context he'd struggled to articulate. The community had spoken in support of their guardianship. Now the decision lay with someone else, and whatever that decision might be, Eli knew they'd honored the trust Harold had placed in them and the courage of the families whose names filled Whitmore's ledger. 1 year later, the bronze memorial plaque gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its inscription catching the light as visitors read the words that had transformed a forgotten warehouse into a beacon of remembrance. In honor of the 847 souls who found freedom through this sanctuary, and in memory of Sarah Elizabeth Mercer, whose vision inspired its preservation. Eli stood beside the plaque, watching his daughter lead a group of middle school students through the memorial garden they'd created where weeds once grew. Lena had blossomed into a confident young historian, her natural gift for storytelling making the warehouse's history come alive for visitors who might otherwise see only old artifacts behind glass. "The Johnson family stood right where you're standing now," she told the students, gesturing toward the preserved foundation stones that marked the original building entrance. They were probably scared, but they were also hopeful. They'd traveled hundreds of miles to get here, and they knew this place meant safety. The transformation had been remarkable but gradual. Judge Kowalski's ruling in favor of continued family guardianship had set everything in motion, but the real work had begun afterward. The Underground Railroad Freedom Network had provided expertise and funding, but the vision and daily dedication had come from Eli and Lena, working together to honor the warehouse's legacy. The restored building retained its historical authenticity while meeting modern preservation standards. Climate-controlled display cases protected the most fragile artifacts, but visitors could still touch reproduction items and experience the hidden rooms that had once sheltered freedom seekers. The underground chamber had become the museum's most powerful space, where Thomas Whitmore's carved names remained visible on the stone walls, each one a testament to lives that had mattered. Dr. Foster had become more than a historical consultant during the restoration process. Her frequent visits to oversee preservation work had evolved into something deeper, a connection with Eli that honored Sarah's memory while allowing space for new possibilities. She brought expertise he needed, while he provided the passionate commitment to the warehouse's mission that reminded her why she'd chosen historical preservation as her life's work. "The numbers tell an incredible story," she was explaining to a visiting delegation from the Smithsonian. 847 documented passages, but the actual number was probably much higher. Many conductors destroyed their records for security reasons, so what we have here represents the most complete documentation of Underground Railroad operations ever discovered. The delegation had come to offer partnership opportunities that would provide additional funding and national recognition. But after a year of fighting to maintain family control, Eli had learned to evaluate such offers carefully. Support was welcome, ownership transfer was not. Jack Morrison had been forced to abandon his development plans, but he'd done so with unexpected grace. The historical designation and community interest had actually enhanced property values in the surrounding area, making his remaining holdings more valuable than his original mixed-use project would have been. He'd even become a modest supporter of the museum, though his contributions came with carefully worded statements about supporting historical preservation, rather than admitting he'd been wrong. The museum's success had exceeded everyone's expectations. Visitors came from across the Midwest to experience the authentic Underground Railroad site, bringing tourism revenue that benefited the entire community. Local businesses had adapted to serve the influx of visitors, and the economic impact had been substantial enough to convert even skeptics into supporters. But the most meaningful success was less tangible. Students who visited the warehouse left with a deeper understanding of courage and sacrifice. Families tracing their genealogy found connections to ancestors they'd never known. Community members discovered pride in their town's role in one of America's most important moral movements. Mrs. Patterson had become the museum's volunteer coordinator, organizing the rotating schedule of community members who helped with tours and maintenance. "Never thought I'd spend my retirement talking about history," she'd admitted to Eli, "but these stories need telling, and we're the ones who know them best." Lena had grown into her role as the museum's youngest guide, her presentations drawing praise from visitors and educational groups alike. She developed a particular gift for connecting with children, helping them understand that the young people who'd hidden in the warehouse centuries ago weren't so different from themselves. "The hardest part for kids to understand isn't that slavery existed," she'd explained to a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch. "It's that regular people like us had to make really hard choices about what was right. But once they get that, they start thinking about what hard choices they might have to make someday." As the afternoon wound down and the last visitors departed, Eli found himself alone in the warehouse's main room, surrounded by the carefully preserved evidence of so much courage and sacrifice. The space felt peaceful now, no longer carrying the weight of hidden secrets, but radiating the satisfaction of stories finally being told. Sarah's wedding ring sat in a place of honor in the memorial display, donated by Eli to represent the personal sacrifices that had made the warehouse's mission possible. The inscription, "Forever Yours," carried new meaning now, not just a promise between husband and wife, but a commitment to values that transcended individual lives. The financial rewards had surprised everyone. The museum's success had generated enough revenue to provide Eli with a modest but steady income as director, while grants and donations covered operational costs and ongoing preservation work. More importantly, the property's protected status and historical significance had made it genuinely valuable enough the millions Morrison had offered, but enough to secure Lena's future while maintaining the family's guardianship role. Lena emerged from the underground chamber, where she'd been checking the preservation systems, her face glowing with the satisfaction of work well done. At 11 years old, she possessed knowledge about underground railroad operations that impressed professional historians, but she wore that expertise lightly, more interested in sharing stories than showcasing scholarship. "Dad, I was thinking about what we should add to the memorial garden," she said as they prepared to lock up for the evening. "Maybe a section for the conductors, not just the families they helped. Mr. Thomas deserves to be remembered too." Eli nodded, struck by his daughter's instinct for honoring all aspects of the warehouse's history. She'd inherited her mother's gift for seeing the whole picture, for understanding that preservation meant more than just protecting artifacts. It meant ensuring that every story found its voice. As they walked toward the truck, Eli caught sight of their reflection in the warehouse windows, father and daughter silhouetted against the building that had become their shared mission. The image reminded him of that first afternoon when they'd stood before the rusted walls, unsure of what they'd inherited or whether they could handle the responsibility. Now he understood that the warehouse had never been his inheritance alone. It was a trust shared between past and future, between the families who'd found sanctuary there and the generations who would learn from their courage. His job wasn't to own that history, but to protect it, not to control those stories, but to ensure they remained alive and accessible. The bronze plaque caught the last rays of sunlight as they drove away, its dedication to Sarah visible from the road. She'd been right about choosing preservation over profit, legacy over convenience. The warehouse had given them more than financial security. It had given them purpose, community, and the knowledge that ordinary people could indeed do extraordinary things when they understood what truly mattered. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories to share, new opportunities to honor the courage of those who'd refused to accept that freedom was only for some. The warehouse would continue serving its original purpose not as a hiding place anymore, but as a beacon of hope that reminded everyone who entered that the journey toward justice was always worth taking, no matter how difficult the path might be.